Hi, welcome everyone. Just going to give people a minute to file in as I see the participant counter is still going up. But thank you all for coming to the Carbon Brief COP16 Key Outcomes webinar. Just a note on how the webinar will run today. Each of our journalists is going to give a little bit of an overview on sort of the main topics that they have been covering over the past 2 weeks at COP16. And then we will be answering, we'll have a lot of time afterwards for audience questions. So please feel free to drop any questions you have in the Q&A box as they come up, and we will do our best to answer as many of them as possible. Shall we get started? Okay. Thanks again, everyone, for coming. My name is Juliana Viglione. I'm Carbon Brief's section editor for Food, Land, and Nature. And today I'm joined by 4 of my highly esteemed colleagues. All 5 of us have been on the ground in Cali, Colombia for the past 2 weeks covering the COP16 biodiversity talks. And we're here to sort of explain all the ins and outs of the negotiations, the key outcomes, and what happens next, which is possibly particularly relevant this time around. So as I said before, each of us is going to give a brief overview, and then we'll open it up for audience questions. So please feel free to drop questions in the Q&A box at any point. And with that, I will hand this over to Yanine. Yanine?
Thanks, Juliana. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us in this webinar. I'm delighted to be able to share this moment with you all, and of course with my Carbon Brief colleagues and our audience. So I'm going to talk about the main outcomes that we saw at COP16 regarding Indigenous peoples and local communities' rights. So I start by telling you a bit more about what were the main priorities of Indigenous peoples at this conference. So, well, basically they had 2 key priorities, which were the creation of a subsidiary body for Indigenous peoples, and the second one was the creation of a program of work to implement one of the articles of the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is the Article AJ. And this article is important because it recognizes the traditional knowledge and practices of Indigenous peoples worldwide for the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. So, yeah, this program of work aims to do and to implement this article of the convention, and fortunately we saw that this COP delivered these 2 priorities. First of all, maybe I'd like to provide some insights and details on the subsidiary body. So the thing at COPs, Indigenous peoples have had a participation participation within these negotiations, but as observers. So have like the power to really raise their voices, to make a strong decision within the negotiations. So now with the establishment of this subsidiary body for Indigenous peoples to implement the program of work that I've already mentioned, Indigenous peoples will be to participate within these negotiations and to have a stronger voice in the coming COPs as well, and in the implementation of the GBF. Before this subsidiary body, what they were doing was working in a working group, which is like less robust, less strong than the current subsidiary body. And this new subsidiary body will be a permanent body or institution for this group, and it will work with parties, but also with Indigenous peoples from all over the world. Now, and the other thing is the program of work on Article 8J, which aims to, of course, implement this article of the convention. And the article also, Article 8J also aims to strengthen the capacities and practices of Indigenous peoples in terms of conservation, restoration, and also includes some information on human rights approaches to implement this program of work for Article 8J. So what I could see in this COP was that Indigenous peoples groups, especially the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity, which is the main organization representing these peoples at the CBD negotiations, they welcomed these two new kind of program and subsidiary body, because now they feel that they will have more, more power to make decisions, no, within negotiations, and also to influence public policies within countries. So for them, it's a victory, is what they describe to this outcomes. And also another, just to finish off my intervention, I'd like to mention that Indigenous peoples also were demanding at this COP like direct access to finance, biodiversity finance, to implement their activities regarding conservation of biodiversity. So that was also like a very important point for them. And what I could, know is that the aim is that Indigenous peoples can have or receive 20% of the funds of the Biodiversity Fund that my colleague Aruna, I'm sure that she's going to talk about it. So I think that's it from now.
Thanks, Yanine. Actually wanted to lead with a much bigger headlining number in terms of finance for Indigenous people, which is the DSi Fund. First of all, it was set up under the COP, which is quite a big deal. They were pushing for, a global biodiversity fund for all of finance. This was instead established for the DSi, and at least half of all of the money that is raised is supposed to go to Indigenous peoples in developed countries, and particularly women and youth, which is a really big deal. It's also an extremely historic fund because for the first time ever, corporations will have to pay into a multilateral fund and pay a percentage either of their revenue as well as their profits. And recognizing the fact that you're drawing genetic diversity from nature, and so therefore nature has to be paid. So that was a pretty historic decision. However, lots of like loopholes as well in the text itself. Of course, we're talking about the range of companies that will include pharmaceutical companies. We're talking about nutraceuticals, which is essentially supplements and things like that. Also in terms of agribusiness, which was almost left out at the end and made an appearance back, which was essentially plant and food breeding companies. So and technology conglomerates, like for instance, artificial intelligence, which is scraping the web of war digital sequences. So some of those very big databases will also have to contribute. Unfortunately, research as well as academia will not have to contribute into the fund. They were there in a bit of the text, but that's been dropped out. Also in especially some countries pushing for the global north, pushing for open access, developing countries looking at increasing traceability. Now, another interesting bit was the appearance of this clause around profit and revenue share, right? Which is a pretty interesting suggestion. It was also one of the models which is proposed by LSE. Now, governments have been left free to pick, whether we are talking about 1% revenue, 1% profit, or 0.1% of the revenue. Now, initially, the model had mostly it was around revenue because profits can change. You can report 0% profit, and whereas revenue and turnover is something that doesn't particularly change. So that is so it's going to be interesting to see how that is picked. Also, the question of should contribute and shall contribute. Now, these are very nerdy things. And in terms of language, we have Simon Evans has this very useful thread of invites should or shall. And in this case, of course, shall is much stronger. Should is also indicating that it can be voluntary. The amount also that we're talking about, whether it's 1% or 0.1%, is at the same time indicative, which means you can fix what that sum is. So we don't know what states will put down as that. And at one point, there was a clause which showed that companies had to demonstrate whether they relied on genetic data or not. If you wanted to opt out of paying, you had to show that you didn't. Now that's gone from the text in its various different iterations. So yeah, that's something to watch, especially on DSi. So yeah, that's so it's quite a landmark decision. We're going to have to see what form it takes, and it was one of those things that was passed right in the last minute, and had states. Of course, the Guardian is reporting that asking the question of whether did states have enough of a quorum. That means were there enough of them to sort of pass this, and we'll get around to that in a minute. But yeah, pretty much DSi as well as finance were the two major headline fights, especially at COP, mostly because of course they involve resources, and we're also talking about transfers between north to south. And right from the start, we've seen this, especially from Who Wants What, from all of the country submissions, that finance was definitely going to be one of those things that is really watched, especially in this year where we're talking about trillions, or at least $1 trillion in climate finance negotiations, to see whether countries have lived up to their target of 20 billion was one of the key fights, and to see how progress had been measured. Now, that was something that developing countries went into very strong. Zimbabwe as well as Brazil revived the fight for a new global biodiversity fund. And that was the running undercurrent throughout the talks. And at the same time that was opposed. And it made an appearance only again as a full suggestion, as a full proposal from the Colombian presidency, and at 3:30 in the morning. And because until then it had been deferred, it was whole fight for the last 2 weeks, and it shows up at the 3:30 a.m. text, instead of something that's going to be bumped to the next session. And that created quite some ripples, and it led to what was quite a confused scene towards the plenary. And it's one of those decisions that's going to be bumped, or one of the first that's picked up whenever this COP resumes. But yeah, I stayed watching until 6:30 a.m., after which, Daisy was up and got to see the actual finale. Daisy, over to you.
Thank you, Runa. My name is Daisy Dunn. I'm Carbon Brief's Associate Editor, and coming from you from London, where I've been for the finale. So I was able to join for the last few hours of the final plenary, as it was UK morning time, and Colombia very early in the morning time. So I'll just briefly tell you a bit more about that, as it was a very extraordinary final plenary for a UN negotiation. So the plenary took over 10 hours. It made COP16 become the longest biodiversity COP in history. And as Aruna alluded to, there were very lengthy discussions that took place on both DSi and on finance for biodiversity. So what we saw really was countries kind of rehashing their positions and restating points throughout the night. And then there were last minute sort of conversations on the floor, and we did manage to see the DSi text adopted, but that took lots and lots of time. So after that, once countries turned back to the finance decision, it was already nearing 8 a.m. Colombia time. So at this point, the plenary had started at 10:15 p.m. the night before, and had been running all through the night into the morning. And many developing country delegates were forced to leave to catch flights home to their countries. They were sort of suggesting in their interventions that they were unable to change their flights, and they were sort of dropping in large numbers. And this was a concern for a lot of parties who felt that there was not the representation from the global south to keep making decisions. And I think Panama called for an assessment of quorum to be taken place. So this is an assessment of whether there is enough representation from parties to keep making decisions. And what they found was that quorum wasn't there. So Susanna Mohammed, the COP16 president, had to very quickly suspend the session, and it was a very abrupt moment. I think a lot of people were left with a lot of questions over what was going to happen next. And then after that, the topic of finance and the final agenda item on the monitoring framework, which my colleague Juliana is going to talk a bit more about, were basically bumped to the next intersessional meetings, which are taking place in Bangkok in October next year. Just one more thing before I hand you over to Juliana. I have been following throughout the summit and before the National Strategies and Action Plans for Biodiversity Loss, these called MBSAPs. And by the end of the summit, what we saw was about 44 parties had come forward with MBSAPs out of 196. So that's around 22% of countries that have produced new MBSAPs. And I should say as well, the deadline for doing that was by COP16. So these countries that haven't done it have effectively missed a deadline that was agreed in Montreal in 2022. At the same time, 119 parties have produced national targets. These are sort of simple lists of how countries plan to tackle biodiversity loss and implement the Global Biodiversity Framework, which is a sort of Paris Agreement for Nature agreed in Montreal. So yeah, that was a sort of an ending of a lack of implementation. The reasons given for countries, a lot of sort of mega diverse countries and major economies complained of not having enough time to carry out the stakeholder processes needed in order to publish their MBSAPs, whereas developing nations said that they weren't unable to access funds in order to put these plans together. So at the end of COP, countries agreed for a new plan for MBSAPs. They adopted a new MBSAPs text. And they didn't set a deadline for late MBSAPs. They just said that countries that haven't yet produced them should do it as soon as possible. But they did stipulate that the Global Environment Facility, the sort of major environmental funding body, should provide funding for MBSAPs for developing countries and to allow them to put them together. So I'm happy to answer more questions on that later on, but for now, I'll hand you over to Juliana.
Great, thanks, Daisy. As I said at the beginning, I'm Juliana. I'm the section editor for Food, Land, and Nature. I'm currently coming to you from Medellin, Colombia, where I'm taking hopefully a few nice days after a very long night at the plenary session. So as Daisy mentioned, one of my main focuses at COP was the monitoring framework. And this is seen as particularly important because one of the main reasons that the previous set of biodiversity targets, the Aichi targets, failed was that there was no sort of monitoring and implementation framework in place. So the monitoring framework actually was agreed at COP15, but sort of similar to how this COP shook out, many of the issues sort of took so long to negotiate in the final stages that they sort of passed this monitoring framework, but also said, like, we're going to revisit this. And so they created an ad hoc group to sort of take a technical view of how to assess countries' progress on different targets. So for, the sort of headline target of the Global Biodiversity Framework is this 30 by 30, protecting 30% of the world's oceans and land by 2030. So that's, you can imagine, sort of a relatively straightforward indicator to measure against. But for, for a target like gender responsiveness, you can't really, it's not quite so straightforward. So this ad hoc group met 6 times over the past 2 years, and they produced their own text, their own set of indicators. And these 2 things were sort of being hashed out at COP16. So getting a monitoring framework was a big priority, and it was looking fairly good, I would say. Like, there were a few spots where parties were disagreeing on particular indicators and particular ways of measuring things. But on the whole, like, it was going sort of slowly but smoothly. And until on, I believe it was the final day, party requested that the entire monitoring framework be placed in square brackets. So for those of you who don't know, square brackets indicate basically a disagreement, or like something that needs to be hashed out. And in putting the entire framework into brackets, the party was basically saying, like, we are not going to agree on a monitoring framework until we have an agreement on finance. And as Aruna said, and as Daisy alluded to, like, they did not reach an agreement on finance, and as a result, there was no monitoring framework adopted. So this is another decision that will be sort of punted to the intersessional meetings next year. Observers that I've spoken to are, sort of hopeful that this will be worked out between now and then. There's lots of time. The intersessionals are scheduled for October of next year, so there's plenty of time for sort of bilateral and smaller informal talks for parties to hash this out. But yeah, that's sort of where we stand on the monitoring framework. And I'll pass it over to Orla for a quick intro on biodiversity and health, and then we'll take some questions.
Great, thanks, Juliana. I just wanted to give, sorry, my name is Orla Dwyer. I'm one of Carbon Brief's food, land and nature journalists. I was also in Cali for the last 2 weeks, and now I am recovering back in London. Just wanted to briefly touch on something that was agreed by the end of the abrupt finale of that ending plenary, which is a global voluntary action plan, essentially highlighting the links between biodiversity and health, which was one of the discussion points at this COP. So this action plan that was agreed is meant to support governments and other stakeholders to better focus on biodiversity and health, and the many interlinkages between these 2 issues in their policies and strategies. And this decision, it has a load of voluntary actions about research and other ways to better understand the links between these 2 issues, and also around things like chemicals, pollution, waste, and human health as well. And something that the experts I was speaking to at COP16 were highlighting is that a big aspect of this plan is around reducing the risks of the spread of diseases between animals and humans, and essentially the issues that are feeding into the risks of pandemics, which has obviously been hugely relevant in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, which is when the negotiations on this global action plan properly kicked off in the past few years. And so essentially the experts are saying that this plan gives policymakers a bit of a toolbox and a sense of how to deal with some of these issues that feed into pandemic risks, because essentially the acceleration of biodiversity loss and also climate change increases the risk of infectious diseases spreading from wildlife to humans, which again is very relevant in the wake of COVID-19. So this plan was like something that experts were pleased and NGOs and people were pleased to see agreed by the end of this COP, given some of the outstanding issues and given that it had been negotiated over the past few years and in relation to COVID-19, but also it's an entirely voluntary plan. So countries can kind of do what they see fit with it. So it kind of remains to be seen how useful it actually will be, but it was one of the things that was signed off before the end of these talks. So I think it'll be interesting to see how countries will use the voluntary actions that were presented in it and how much they will actually be implemented.
Great, thank you, Orla. So we've had lots of questions coming in, which is great. Aruna, I know you are on a layover right now and might have to rush a bit early to catch a flight. So I'll direct the first question to you. Regarding the 20 billion from rich countries that has been promised in the GBF, I've seen conflicting reports about progress. Some say that we have only seen A, about 400 million, B, others indicate around 2.42 billion based on money approved for the GEF so far, and C, a third figure from an OECD report indicates as much as 15 billion, and this seems to include loans for nature. Which one is it? Simple question, right?
Very simple question. The answer is kind of all of the above and none of the above. No, it is all of the above in the sense that biodiversity finance is complex and complicated and should be easier to track progress, but it isn't. And that is one of the key questions also raised by developing countries at COP, saying that, you know, the OECD data, which talks about overseas development finance, we have data from 2022. So we haven't actually seen close to this at the start of COP16. What does that look like, right? So that 15 billion, which is cited, is for overseas development finance, of which some of that can be for biodiversity. It can be for a bunch of stuff which is tagged as biodiversity. But the main thing is, and what kind of finance is it, right? Like, for instance, some countries, a large part of what they gave was loans. So does that count in terms of what you've given? So now another tracker, there was a special fund known as the Global Biodiversity Framework Fund. It was an interim fund. It's under the Global Environmental Facility. That has contributions. It was basically, it was around 240 million at the start of COP16. There were around 163 million that was pledged, total taking it up to around 400 million, give or take. So yeah, that's also right, but that is grant money, right? So that's not loans, but it's still, that is purely grant money. Yeah, and at the end of COP16, we're talking 400 million in 2024. So, and the target, of course, is 20 billion by 2025. We have 3 months around to 2025. So yeah, those were the questions of, you know, why are we getting these different numbers? How do we track progress? Will we be able to hit that number? And which is why the call for a fund as well, separate fund to sort of make sure those allocations are coming through to countries without, you know, as it is, it's coming as loans, but those intermediate charges in between. So yeah, it's a difficult one. And I think that was what the call was for. Better transparency. How do we know whether you're actually getting to the target? And if that money is actually going to biodiversity? Yeah, and to see where that progress is. So yeah, I hope that makes sense on what those three numbers are.
Great, thanks, Aruna. We've had a few questions coming in on the decisions on climate and biodiversity, including one about sort of promoting climate and biodiversity synergy under the two conventions. So maybe Daisy, you could take the first part of that, and Orla, I know you were following sort of links between conventions, if you would like to jump in as well.
Yeah, sure. So I was following the negotiations for the climate change and biodiversity text, which was adopted in the final plenary. It was turned to as countries were still sort of figuring out DSi. The adopted text has not appeared online in terms of you cannot access it and find it and read it for yourselves. I do know from watching the final plenary that some last minute adjustments were made to text, including removing references to biodiversity loss being a form of loss and damage, and removing some of the references to the risks from marine and solar geoengineering, which are techniques to alter the earth basically to lessen climate impacts, either by drawing down CO2 from the atmosphere or by reflecting away sunlight. Yeah, so that text was adopted, and there, I think, and other things to mention that were left out from that text. In a sort of early draft, Colombia has suggested including a lot of language about fossil fuels. So at the COP28 climate summit, countries agreed to transition away from fossil fuels, and Colombia suggested including that in the climate change and biodiversity text. However, it did not appear in later drafts, that reference, and as far as I know, it's not in the final adopted version. I'll hand over to Orla to add some more thoughts.
Yeah, I can just add that there was another decision that was adopted at this COP around the links and the cooperations between the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is the one behind this Biodiversity Summit, and also other organizations dealing with similar and kind of related issues. So a big focus in part of this decision was around the Rio Conventions, which is the things that are behind the Biodiversity COP, the Climate COP, and the Desertification COP, which you may not have heard as much about, but they're the three major COPs that are tackling these interconnected issues. And the interrelated nature of them is something that was definitely discussed a lot at this COP, and also has been discussed at previous climate COPs, and just kind of for the last few years in particular. There was an opinion piece in the World Economic Forum from the secretariats behind these three conventions a couple of months ago, talking about how the current ways that we tackle these three issues of climate change, biodiversity loss, and desertification, just these three issues, is not working, and that they can't be tackled in isolation. You know, they're part of a bigger picture, and that dealing with the three of them separately just isn't going to be able to tackle them all, because you can't tackle one without tackling all of them. And that was something we saw a piece in Reuters a few months ago as well, where the COP16 president, Susanna Mohammed, was saying that Colombia in future might send this unified pledge to these three COPs instead of three separate submissions, because currently countries have to send separate pledges to the three conventions saying how they're going to tackle the three issues. And it's something that developing countries in particular have been saying, wouldn't it be better if we were able to submit one pledge instead of having to put forward all of these different plans? So it's definitely, that wasn't discussed in the actual text of this decision, but that's just kind of give a flavor of some of the talk on the cooperation that was discussed. And there were also a lot of other conventions mentioned in this decision, and things like the United Nations Environment Programme, I believe, was mentioned, and the Food and Agriculture Organization at the UN. So a lot of interesting things in that, and there's going to be updates on how the cooperation is going on all these issues at a meeting before the next COP summit in 2 years. So it is something that's being discussed, but there was no major decision on what they're going to do about all these synergies, as they call them, between the CBD and also a lot of different conventions. But it is talked about at COP.
Great, thank you, Orla. Yanine, if I can hand over to you for a few questions on Indigenous peoples. So someone was wondering how the term Indigenous peoples is defined in the context of the CBD. And another person asks, how unified are sort of the various Indigenous groups in advancing common priorities and common interests at the COP?
Thanks, Juliana. Yes. First of all, thanks for your questions. And okay, I'm not feeling quite comfortable responding to the first question on what do we understand by Indigenous peoples in the CBD context. But maybe I can also try to investigate that further and down the line, and let the person that asked this question know. Regarding the second question, of course, so the idea with this kind of international negotiations is that representatives from different indigenous communities and indigenous groups attend these negotiations. And there is actually a kind of an organization that comprises like probably the majority of the indigenous representatives and indigenous communities from all over the world. And this is the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity, which has a worldwide presence. So yeah, so its role is like to really kind of like put together all the demands and all the priorities and suggestions, recommendations from these people in one single probably position that they also release via press briefings, via the conferences, and also within the negotiations. So yeah, of course. Also, I think it's worth mentioning that not all the indigenous communities have the same views and proposals for the different topics regarding these peoples that are being negotiating within the COPs. So, but of course, like this is the major or the main body and organization that groups these peoples.
Thank you, Janine. Arun, if I can hand it back over to you for some more details on DSi. So someone asked, how binding is the DSi Fund proposal, and are there actually plans by governments to mandate it? And then maybe closely linked to that is, how are the rules for this set? And will each member country sort of separately set a contribution threshold and decide whether or not it is compulsory to contribute?
Now, that's a really interesting question, and some of this stuff is also a little fuzzy at this point. So I think even the experts who are on various flights and reading through it are trying to figure out, okay, how is that going to be set? But a couple of things just to note is one of the details is the fact that countries have been invited to put their views down in terms of what do they think of the multilateral mechanism, what are the rules, are there additional views. They've been asked to commission a study to examine options for making DSi publicly available. So basically they're going to submit some of that to the SPI, which is again a subsidiary body, to consider these views and see whether there's additional stuff that they want to add in terms of fair and equitable benefit sharing. Yes, at the same time, states and what their roles is in terms of how mandatory. Now, I've talked you through some of the stuff of how mandatory, how companies could possibly decide to disclose or not disclose whether they're using this material, whether they contribute. But then again, we're talking about responsible businesses. We have said we've seen statements by nature positive, quote unquote, businesses of issuing statements. So whether the corporate sector does actually rise to what has been said here and contribute, that will be interesting to see, and whether states do it. One of the things that the decision does say is that at COP18, the mechanism will be reviewed. And at the same time, they will decide whether to adjust this threshold as well as the contribution rate. At the same time, yes, states do have some discretion. One of the things that was especially fought for was like, how does this interact with national laws, right? And that was a fight towards the end. India had intervened, talking about some degree of sovereignty and how that affects national access and benefit sharing laws. They've retained some of that. But yes, we'll be seeing more details come in through it. But yeah, how mandatory, I think it depends on how it doesn't seem very mandatory in the moment, but it is. It will be in terms of how it's implemented and which businesses do actually step up a bit.
And is there any sort of clarity or understanding right now about how or whether this will apply to companies that are based in the US, which is not a party to the Convention on Biological Diversity?
At this point, I think people are just still parsing the decision. But yeah, I think one of the things that is important is also the fact that, it is being seen as one of the means of funding, which is adding to biodiversity finance, was included as well as the resource mobilization decision. Some of those questions around private funding was a huge tussle where states were like, okay, well, we don't have the money to give. We're talking about voluntary finance largely, or looking at innovative finance. We saw a lot of that in terms of biodiversity offsets as well as credits, and a huge amount of dialogue as well. Various different financial mechanisms sort of at COP16. And I think at one point, there were developing country ministers who were like, this is nice, it's fine, glad that we agree on all sources, but at the same time, it shouldn't take away from public funding and public finance that comes directly from states. Whether US companies will have to give, or whether if they are users of data, in that sense, that they would have to technically or should contribute. Again, it's a big should. But yeah, I think it's up to now the legal experts to read and see how this takes effect.
Thank you. And tied into that, and we talked about this at our preview webinar, but we did get a question on the US's non-signature of the treaty. The US is not a party to the CBD because becoming a party to it requires ratification by the US Senate of I believe, a supermajority in the Senate. There's sort of no push for the US to ratify, as far as I understand. And they do have a presence at the talks, both, sub-regional governments. The state of California sent a delegation to COP16. There are academics, there are obviously company representatives, but they're not party, so they don't have a formal say in the negotiations. We got another question on, let's see. I'm trying not to give all of the questions in a row to Aruna. Let's see. There was something on zoonotic disease. Okay. So could Orla tell us more about the voluntary plan, so the Health and Biodiversity Action Plan, relating to zoonoses, and does this specifically address forms of animal agriculture as drivers of zoonotic disease? Orla, do you think you could take that one?
Yeah, I can touch briefly on that. There's a lot of things running through all of our heads right now, so I can't remember the exact wording that made it into the final text, but there was one aspect of the wording related to this that was watered down in the final version compared to previous drafts that were put forward, even throughout the talks. So there was language in an earlier draft, which essentially it recognized that several human-mediated factors are likely driving zoonotic diseases. And among the factors that was mentioned in this previous draft was around unsustainable agricultural intensification and also the increasing human demand for meat. So this was mentioned in a previous draft. But then in the final draft, we're still waiting for the actual final version of the text to come through. But the most recent version that had no brackets essentially was softened and watered down a bit, essentially to say that emerging infectious diseases can be exacerbated by human activities. So things like unsustainable land use, change practices, and habitat fragmentation. So I think you can see from that, even though this was a voluntary plan, things like agriculture and deforestation, they can still be these really contentious issues that countries want to remove from the final text before they make it in. So I'll have to go back and look at the actual text to see how agriculture was mentioned, but I think that is just one example of how it was removed from the text throughout the negotiation process. But you can read more about it in our main piece, and you can find the text there as well.
Thank you. Also on the sort of topic of agriculture and things being perhaps watered down in the text, we've gotten a few questions on the outcome of Target 7 and Indicator 7.2 negotiations. For those of you who don't have your targets memorized, Target 7 is about pesticide use. And this, as you may be aware, was sort of the main target and indicator that countries were quibbling over when discussing the monitoring framework. So, I mean, the outcome essentially is that there is no outcome because the entire text was not adopted and has been pushed to the subsidiary body meeting. I was following along sort of in subsequent drafts. So to give a brief overview, at COP15, the monitoring framework was agreed that I believe the indicator that they agreed on was pesticide environment concentration, which is not a particularly measurable metric. Then this joint group, ad hoc group on indicators went away, and they came back with a metric on AT, which is applied total aggregated toxicity, or those 4 words in some order. So where the monitoring framework ended up was that sort of both of these options were there in brackets as a headline indicator. Parties were sort of back and forth as to whether you can have more than one headline indicator if that doesn't sort of defeat the purpose of having one indicator that everyone reports on. And so I sort of anticipate that this is something that will be brought up and rehashed next year at the subsidiary body meetings and sort of in between now and then. And to answer someone else's question, the party that sort of bracketed the entire monitoring framework, I believe that was the DRC. They are a big player in the CBD negotiations, and they've been a strong voice for resource mobilization and for a new fund. And so this was sort of them trying to link the two and say that we don't, developing countries and global South countries cannot implement and properly monitoring without without a real commitment to funding from the global North. Okay, we had a question on mainstreaming biodiversity. So someone says that they heard that sort of text was one of the COP16 successes. What does it mean concretely? Daisy, I'm not sure if you can explain exactly what mainstreaming biodiversity is.
Yeah, so I've been following it in Colombia, so I think I can now confidently describe what it is. Mainstream biodiversity is kind of referring to getting any kind of policy or practice to consider biodiversity at the sort of highest level. So if there's like a new building being built, it's about getting biodiversity impacts into planning laws. If for agriculture, it's about getting biodiversity impacts into agricultural laws. And mainstream biodiversity is just the term that we use to describe this sort of set of things that need to be achieved. And if you think about it, it obviously touches on loads of the targets of the Global Biodiversity Framework. It's all about, agriculture, big buildings, pesticide use, any kind of use or impact by humans. There's a push to get mainstreaming biodiversity up on the agenda. You could call it a success at COP in terms of the mainstreaming biodiversity text was adopted by parties before the end of the final plenary. In terms of what the text actually said, it didn't really commit countries to anything new. Sorry, it's my cat's time to make an appearance. Countries weren't asked to sort of like take any, they weren't invited or urged to take any actions really that they're not already taking. But one observer told me that an important section of that text was that the executive secretary, so Astrid Shoemaker, was invited to basically keep a work stream going on mainstream biodiversity, which means it will stay on the front burner, as they put it, and we should see it coming up in subsequent COPs.
Thanks, Daisy. One question that got emailed in beforehand was whether there were any particular proposals regarding oceans and marine life. So this is something that I was following quite closely. There was an agenda item on the conservation and sustainable use of marine and coastal biodiversity and island biodiversity. And so there were two decisions that came out of this. One was a decision on conservation and sustainable use, and one was on further work on ecologically or biologically significant marine areas, or EBSAs. And so the first of those, the conservation and sustainable use decision, that sort of laid out some priorities for the Secretariat to sort of help parties along, help parties in their implementation of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. So there were lots of things in there. It talked about illegal, underreported and unregulated fishing. It talked about marine geoengineering. It talked about, I think it talked about subsidies that are subsidies for activities that are harmful to marine and coastal biodiversity. Again, this is one of the areas where the final text hasn't been published yet, so I'm not entirely sure what all made it into the final text. But the other decision, the EBSA's decision, was actually seen as a pretty big win. I hear there were cheers in the room from, I am assuming, like a small subset of really passionate ocean people when it was adopted. But this was a decision that was 8 years in the making. So EBSAs, it's a scientific process of sort of identifying and describing these areas that are significant in some way, whether they're like super biodiversity rich or if they're like a really unique ecosystem. And they were described, this whole set of EBSAs was described, but there was no sort of process in place for modifying those descriptions. And so what this COP achieved was that they laid out this whole framework for further identification and description and modification of the descriptions. And this is important because while it's a scientific exercise and a technical exercise and not a political one, it does sort of lay the groundwork for, for someone to come in and say like, oh, scientists have identified this really important area. Like now we as policymakers should protect it. Like we should create a marine protected area, or we should put other measures in place. So this was seen as sort of one of the wins within a subset of the CBD community. Sorry, let me catch up. We had some questions also on the $700 billion finance target laid out in the GBF, and some questions about harmful subsidies, which obviously go hand in hand. So Aruna, could you talk about sort of the question of where will this $700 billion come from? And then I don't know if you or anyone else wants to jump in on sort of any talk around harmful subsidies that occurred at COP16.
So yeah, that's a really interesting and a really important number, right? Of course, there were various reports through COP saying that's actually much bigger. So the actual biodiversity funding gap is 700 billion a year. Now, of this, 500 billion was supposed to come from eliminating harmful subsidies, from removing, repurposing, reforming, especially on that target. Nothing was done in the previous decade. There was just really pitiful progress. And that's something that a lot of people were raising, where you're talking about the inability to raise. So 500 billion coming from subsidy reform, elimination. 200 billion was supposed to come from flows from developed to developing countries, of which this was broken into 20 billion by 2025. And 30 billion from 2025 to 2030. So yeah, that comes up to around 210 or 200 billion. So yeah, add those both up and you get the 700 billion. But yeah, I mean, in terms of the question that there is no public finance and we need to look at various other sources, And a lot of developing countries were raising the question that, okay, what are we talking in terms of subsidies, right? And there was a State of Finance for Nature report that estimated that in all, there was 7 trillion in nature harming subsidies, and of which, of course, 1.7 is coming generally from states. And yeah, so talking about the fact that there is money, there is that's on the table. So why isn't there, commensurate public finance? And why aren't we able to raise that? And why are we talking generally about various other market-based mechanisms when a lot of this can be raised, but through eliminating or reforming, especially when it comes to things that are in states' hands, such as subsidies. So yeah. It's a really important question and a really yawning gap, and it's interesting to see how much is going to be raised, and that is definitely going to be one of the first points that's picked up at the next intersessionals. So yeah, keen to see how that happens. Yeah.
Yeah, and I can just add on subsidies that I was speaking to someone at the Nature Conservancy, TNC, and they have actually been looking at sort of how many countries have started at least looking at subsidy reform and sort of identifying biodiversity harmful subsidies with a view towards reforming them. So I think that's definitely something that people are thinking about and talking about as well. We're running pretty close to time, but we have gotten a bunch of questions on MBSAPs, and I would be remiss to not include any of them. So someone asked if anyone has done an analysis on MBSAPs and have a sense of to what extent these targets actually respond to the GBF goals. And another question somewhat related to that was sort of how bad is it that only 20% of countries met this target? So Daisy, can I hand it over to you?
Thank you. So yes, Carbon Brief has been analysing MBSAPs for the past year or so. So if you head to our website, you can see our MBSAP tracker where we have looked at every country's MBSAP and pulled out the key details. It's not quite up to date since the end of the summit, but it's got a lot of information in there, and we will be updating it more. In terms of how bad it is that we only have 22% of countries submitting new MBSAPs, I think one way you can think of this is countries did set themselves a deadline to release new MBSAPs ahead of COP16. That was what was negotiated and agreed in Montreal in 2022. So the fact is the vast majority of countries have missed this deadline. I think there has been also lots of sort of mention of the fact that 119 parties have submitted national targets. And one observer noted to me that the majority of countries that have submitted national targets but not MBSAPs are developing countries, and developing countries have said that they were unable to access finance in order to produce MBSAPs. So it shows that perhaps developing countries have the will to produce MBSAPs, but they don't have the means. I do think we have to look at some of the bigger countries. So that's sort of what I produced an investigation with The Guardian ahead of COP16, and we really looked at big economies and mega and sort of emerging economies, mega diverse countries that hadn't produced MBSAPs, and looked at the reasons why they were not able to do so. So, for example, at this current point in time, the only G7 nation that is still working to produce an MBSAP is the UK. And the reasons they've given for not producing an MBSAP ahead of COP16 is that there was a change of power in Scotland earlier this year, which prevented them from getting out the MBSAP under the Conservative government. And since Labour has come into power, they said that they basically want to have the time to be able to produce an MBSAP that they're happy with, and they didn't think they'd be able to do it before COP16. Brazil, the country that has more biodiversity than anywhere else in the world, also has not produced an MBSAP yet. And they said to me in The Guardian that the reason they haven't done it is because they're a giant country. They have lots and lots of municipalities and stakeholders, indigenous groups, and they just were not able to get around and consult them all on the MBSAP before COP16. but they plan to do it in the new year. So yeah, that's just kind of, I think you can draw from that if it's good or bad, but that's the reasons that countries have given us. So I hope that's helpful.
Great, thank you, Daisy. Maybe the last thing is we had a couple of questions come in on sort of what happens next at the COP. There's been, thank you, Aruna, for your time and expertise.
Still on the route from COP16 to going back home. So yeah, I'm going to try and get home.
Yes, so before we sign off, maybe just very quickly on sort of what comes next and how extraordinary was the suspension of this COP. Someone asked how many COPs have been suspended in this manner. I don't know that number, but I do know that COP15, in Montreal, was also suspended, and sort of some decisions taken up at a resumed session of COP15. A bit of a different dynamic in that, COP15 obviously did produce sort of its headline decision of the global biodiversity framework, whereas at this one, it was some of the bigger issues that were sort of held to the end and not agreed. But so the COP16 will hold a resumed session. I think it's generally assumed or understood that this will happen sort of in conjunction with the subsidiary body meetings. So that's the meetings of, I guess, more technical groups of negotiators, or negotiators focusing on more technical issues such as implementation and the science and technology and technical needs. So that will be held in October 2025 in Bangkok. And yes, it's I think assumed, if not fully confirmed yet, that that's when when COP16 will hold this sort of resumed session and hopefully be able to gavel through those final decisions. I don't know if anyone has anything else to add to that.
Yes, I'd like to invite you all to our next webinar that we'll be hosting today at 7 p.m. London, 2 p.m. Colombia time. And this is going to be a webinar in Spanish language. So we'll address the key outcomes of this COP16 and also the role of Latin America and the Caribbean. So everyone is invited. Hope you can join us.
Yes, definitely. Hope to see some of you there as well. And thank you for joining us. This recording will be posted on the Carbon Brief website sometime in the coming days. Thank you for following along with all of our COP16 coverage.